You sit down, and a silent, automated sequence of structural degradation begins. As your gluteal muscles compress against the surface of a chair, the mechanoreceptors within your fascia register a profound drop in tension, signaling your central nervous system to down-regulate neural drive to the largest muscle group in your body. This is not another video telling you to drink warm lemon water, buy an ergonomic lumbar support pillow, or stand for 8 hours a day at a motorized desk. Those are superficial band-aids applied to a foundational structural crisis. What is actually occurring beneath your skin is a profound, systemic violation of an evolutionary blueprint that took 350 million years to engineer. When you drop your pelvis into a modern seat, you are not simply resting. You are actively triggering a cascade of cellular, mechanical, and hydrostatic failures that alter the physical shape of your skeleton, starve your spinal discs of oxygen, and warp the neural signaling between your brain and your lower limbs. To understand the magnitude of this disruption, we must examine the human spine not as a static column of bone, but as a dynamic, pressurized tensegrity structure designed for continuous movement. Your spine relies on an intricate balance of compression-resistant bones and high-tension soft tissues, specifically the thoracolumbar fascia, the psoas major, and the deep intrinsic stabilizers like the multifidus. When a hominid stands upright, the lumbar spine naturally adopts a state of lordosis, a gentle inward curvature that distributes the downward force of gravity evenly across the fibrocartilaginous intervertebral discs. In this standing posture, the axial load is shared optimally between the solid vertebral bodies and the posterior facet joints. The neural pathways are clear, blood flow is uninhibited, and the hydrostatic pressure within the nucleus pulposus, the gelatinous core of each spinal disc, is perfectly balanced. The moment you sit down, this elegant engineering system collapses. As your thighs form a 90-degree angle with your torso, the pelvis is forced into a posterior tilt. This backward rotation of the pelvis completely obliterates the natural lumbar lordosis, flattening the lower back and forcing the lumbar vertebrae into a state of flexion. In this flexed position, the mechanical forces acting on your spinal discs shift catastrophically. Instead of an even, downward compression, the interior portion of the vertebral bodies pinches together, squeezing the intervertebral discs like a wedge. This creates a severe posterior hydrostatic gradient, forcing the nucleus pulposus backward against the delicate, concentric rings of the endless fibrosis. Over hours, days, and years of continuous sitting, this persistent backward pressure stretches and tears these microscopic collagen fibers, paving the way for eventual disc protrusion, herniation, and severe nerve root impingement. The damage, however, extends far beyond the localized pressure on your spinal discs. Because the human body operates as an integrated kinetic chain, the posterior tilting of the pelvis pulls the entire musculoskeletal framework out of alignment. To keep your eyes facing forward while your lower spine is collapsed, your thoracic spine must compensate by increasing its outward curvature, a state known as hyperkyphosis. This structural shift drags your scapulae forward and rotates your humerus bone inward, shortening the pectoralis minor and locking the upper trapezius into a state of chronic, ischemic contraction. Consequently, your head protrudes forward, away from your body's true center of mass. For every single inch your head moves forward from its optimal alignment, the effective weight of your skull increases by approximately 10 pounds, forcing the deep cervical extensors to work tirelessly against a punishing mechanical disadvantage just to keep you looking at your screen. This structural distortion triggers a state of profound muscular imbalance that physical therapists refer to as lower cross syndrome. While you sit, your hip flexors, primarily the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris, are held in a chronically shortened position. Over time, the body adapts to this state through a process called adaptive shortening, wherein the sarcomeres within the muscle tissue physically decrease in number, permanently tightening the hip flexors. Simultaneously, a phenomenon known as reciprocal inhibition takes place. Because the hip flexors are hyperactive and shortened, the nervous system automatically sends inhibitory signals to their structural antagonists, the gluteus maximus. Your brain literally forgets how to fire your glutes, leading to gluteal amnesia. When you finally do stand up, these shortened hip flexors pull your pelvis forward into an anterior tilt, while your deactivated glutes fail to provide countertension. leaving your lower back exposed to sheer mechanical forces it was never designed to endure. As these muscular imbalances solidify, the deep intrinsic stabilizing system of the spine completely shuts down. The multifidus muscles, a series of tiny, highly specialized muscle fascicles that run along the posterior aspect of the vertebrae, are packed with an extraordinarily high density of muscle spindles. These spindles act as the spine's primary proprioceptive sensors, constantly feeding real-time data to the cerebellum regarding the exact position, micro-rotation, and safety of each individual spinal segment. When you sit and lean against the backrest of a chair, the external support replaces the need for intrinsic stabilization. The multifidus muscles, starved of neural stimulation, begin to atrophy at an alarming rate. Within weeks of chronic sitting, these vibrant, highly responsive muscle fibers undergo fatty infiltration, meaning they are literally replaced by fat tissue. The spine loses its internal guidance system, leaving it highly vulnerable to acute injury from even the most mundane movements, such as bending over to tie a shoe. This lack of movement also severely compromises the fluid dynamics of the spine. Intervertebral discs are unique among human tissues because they are completely avascular, meaning they possess no direct blood supply. They cannot simply draw nutrients from passing capillaries to repair themselves. Instead, they rely entirely on a mechanical process called hydrodynamic imbibition. When you walk, run, or change positions, the changing pressure gradients act like a pump, squeezing metabolic waste products out of the disc during compression and drawing fresh, nutrient-rich fluid and oxygen during decompression. When you remain seated for hours on end, this vital pumping mechanism completely ceases. The spinal discs become stagnant pools of metabolic waste, starved of oxygen and glucose. The chondrocytes responsible for maintaining the extracellular matrix of the disc begin to die, accelerating the onset of degenerative disc disease and causing the spine to age prematurely. This structural starvation of the intervertebral discs triggers a secondary, equally destructive crisis within the microscopic architecture of the surrounding connective tissues. Surrounding your entire musculoskeletal system is a continuous, fluid-filled web of collagen and elastin known as the fascial network. In a healthy, active body, this fascia is highly hydrated, allowing muscles and tendons to glide past one another with minimal friction. However, when you sit motionless for hours, the local interstitial fluid becomes viscous and stagnant, transforming from a slippery gel into a dense, glue-like solid. The deep layers of the thoracolumbar fascia, which should act as a dynamic, high-tensile trampoline supporting your lower back, begin to form aberrant cross-links. This fascial binding effectively locks the lumbar joints into their distorted positions, cementing the mechanical errors and ensuring that even when you do attempt to move, your tissues remain stiff, brittle, and highly prone to micro-tearing. As the structural integrity of the fascia degrades, the cardiovascular system takes a direct and measurable hit from the prolonged immobilization of the lower limbs. The human circulatory system is designed to work in tandem with physical movement. Specifically, the rhythmic contraction of the calf muscles acts as a secondary heart, pumping deoxygenated blood upward through one-way venous valves against the pull of gravity. When you sit, this muscular pump is completely deactivated. Blood pools in the deep veins of the lower legs, increasing hydrostatic venous pressure and slowing down systemic circulation. Simultaneously, the absolute lack of muscular contraction within the quadriceps and gluteals causes a catastrophic drop in the production of an essential enzyme known as lipoprotein lipase. This enzyme is bound to the capillary walls of active muscles, where its primary job is to catch passing fats and triglycerides in the bloodstream and convert them into energy. Within just 40 minutes of continuous sitting, cellular production of lipoprotein lipase drops by nearly 90%. Causing circulating triglycerides to skyrocket and forcing the cardiovascular system to operate in a thick, sluggish, lipid-heavy environment that rapidly hardens arterial walls. This metabolic slowdown directly impacts the body's primary system for glucose regulation, sending shockwaves through the endocrine architecture. In a standing or moving body, the vast surface area of skeletal muscle tissue acts as a massive metabolic sink, readily absorbing glucose from the bloodstream via specialized transport proteins called GLUT-4 receptors. Crucially, when muscles are actively contracting, these GLUT-4 receptors migrate to the cell membranes automatically, allowing glucose to enter the cells without requiring a signal from insulin. When you sit down and silence these muscles, this non-insulin-mediated glucose uptake completely flatlines. Your cells become deaf to the presence of circulating sugar. To compensate for the rising blood glucose levels, the beta cells of your pancreas are forced to pump out massive, exhausting quantities of insulin. Over months of chronic sitting, this constant hormonal flooding downregulates the sensitivity of insulin receptors throughout your liver and fat tissues, driving the body toward peripheral insulin resistance and setting the stage for metabolic syndrome long before visceral fat even begins to accumulate on your frame. While your metabolism stalls, the physical compaction of your torso inflicts severe mechanical stress on your internal organs and the primary engine of your respiratory system. When your pelvis tilts backward and your lumbar spine collapses into flexion, the natural space within your abdominal cavity is sharply compressed. Your stomach, intestines, and liver are literally squeezed together, increasing intra-abdominal pressure and physically impeding the natural peristaltic waves of your digestive tract. This compression forces stomach acid upward against the lower esophageal sphincter, driving chronic acid reflux and slowing down the transit time of waste through your colon. More critically, this compressed posture locks your primary breathing muscle, the diaphragm, into a state of chronic restriction. In an upright posture, the dome-shaped diaphragm drops downward during inhalation, expanding the lungs and gently massaging the abdominal organs. When you slump into a chair, the ribs collapse downward, preventing the diaphragm from fully descending. To compensate for this structural blockage of the diaphragm, your nervous system is forced to recruit the secondary, accessory muscles of respiration, namely the scalenes, the sternocleidomastid, and the pectoralis minor in your neck and chest. These small muscles were never designed to handle the burden of 20,000 breaths per day. As they overwork to lift your rib cage from the top, they become chronically hypertonic, compressing the delicate nerves of the brachial plexus and restricting the vertebral arteries that channel blood up into your brain. Because chest breathing is shallow and inefficient, it fails to utilize the highly vascularized lower lobes of your lungs, leading to poor oxygen to carbon dioxide exchange. This persistent chemical imbalance triggers a low-grade, chronic state of hypercapnia and excess of carbon dioxide in the blood, which your amygdala interprets as a continuous, ambient threat. Your brain responds by keeping your sympathetic nervous system locked on, bathing your tissues in a slow, steady drip of the stress hormone cortisol, leaving you feeling chronically fatigued yet strangely anxious at your desk. This persistent state of low-grade neurological stress is further aggravated by the profound changes occurring within your cerebrospinal fluid dynamics. Your brain and spinal cord are suspended in a clear, nutrient-rich liquid that acts as a shock absorber and a waste clearance system, flushing out metabolic debris during your sleep cycles. The circulation of this cerebrospinal fluid is highly dependent on the physical movement of the sacrum and the cranium, a mechanical relationship often called the craniosacral pump. When you sit in a slumped position, the sacrum is physically locked into an unnatural, non-yielding posterior position, while the forward head posture compresses the suboccipital region at the base of the skull. This dual structural constriction chokes the natural, rhythmic pulsation of cerebrospinal fluid through the spinal canal. The brain's internal filtration system slows to a crawl, allowing cellular waste products like amyloid beta and tau proteins to accumulate in the interstitial spaces of the cerebral cortex, clouding your cognitive faculties, dimming your focus, and manifesting as that ubiquitous afternoon brain fog. At the very center of this systemic collapse lies the profound distortion of the nervous system's primary sensory highway, the sciatic nerve. Measuring roughly the width of a human thumb, the sciatic nerve originates from the lumbar and sacral nerve roots, traveling deep beneath the gluteus maximus and down the back of each leg. When you sit on a traditional chair, your body weight applies a direct, localized compressive force right over the ischial tuberosity, the sit bone, and the piriformis muscle. This intense mechanical pressure compresses the vasa nervorum, the tiny microscopic blood vessels that wind around nerve trunks to supply them with oxygen. Deprived of oxygen, the sciatic nerve enters a state of ischemic distress, misfiring sensory signals that present as an ambiguous, deep ache in the gluteal region, tightness in the hamstrings, or a dull numbness radiating down into the calves, signaling that the structural foundation of your lower body is slowly being starved alive. To reverse this systemic collapse and liberate the nervous system from chronic compression, we must look beyond modern ergonomic myths and target the evolutionary architecture of the deep core. Reclaiming your structural integrity requires a precise, neurological re-education of the body, starting with the immediate reactivation of the multifidus and the deep pelvic floor stabilizers. We begin by dismantling the adaptive shortening of the hip flexors. To release a chronically shortened psoas major, you must perform a passive, high-angle developmental lunging protocol. By stepping forward and dropping the posterior knee to the floor, you must actively tilt the pelvis backward into a conscious anterior to posterior pelvic rotation. This subtle movement instantly exposes the deep fibers of the iliopsoas to a high tensile stretch, signaling the hyperactive muscle spindles to down-regulate their baseline tonus through autogenic inhibition. Once the front of the pelvis is structurally unlocked, we must address the neural silence of the posterior chain by reversing gluteal amnesia. This is achieved by utilizing the motor pattern known as the hip hinge, a pure sagittal plane movement that isolates pelvic rotation from lumbar flexion. By standing with feet hip-width apart and initiating the movement by driving the ischial tuberosities straight backward, you force the hamstrings and gluteus maximus into a deep eccentric loading phase. Crucially, during this phase, you must consciously project your breath into the lower abdominal wall, maximizing intra-abdominal pressure to create a hydrostatic splint that completely stabilizes the lumbar vertebrae. At the nadir of this movement, your brain is forced to bypass the dormant pathways and directly recruit the high-threshold motor units of the gluteal complex to drive the pelvis back into extension, restoring the essential countertension required to protect your lower back. To permanently maintain this newly acquired space within the joints, we must deploy a daily structural reset designed to activate the deep core muscles that have undergone fatty infiltration. By dropping to your hands and knees into an all-fours quadruped position, you completely eliminate the crushing axial load of gravity on the spine. From this neutral posture, you slowly extend the contralateral limb, simultaneously reaching one arm forward and the opposite leg backward until they form a perfectly straight line parallel to the ground. This movement triggers an immediate, cross-lateral neurological stabilization requirement. The nervous system has no choice but to deeply engage the deep, intrinsic multifidus muscles on the opposite side of the active limbs to prevent the lumbar spine from rotating or collapsing. Holding this position for 10 slow, deep diaphragmatic breaths forces these dormant muscle spindles to fire rapidly, clearing out metabolic stagnation and stimulating cellular hypertrophy within the deep spinal stabilizing columns. Finally, we must deliberately alter our daily workspace behavior to mimic ancestral physical variability, transitioning from static chairs to dynamic ground-based or unsupported resting postures. Sitting flat on the floor with your legs crossed, or dropping into a deep and supported ancestral squat completely changes the biomechanical demands placed on your skeleton. In an unsupported squat, the pelvis is naturally guided into an optimal alignment. The hip capsules are forced into full flexion and external rotation, and the lower back is allowed to decompress without losing its muscular tone. If you must remain at a desk, you must enforce the rule of the 20-minute physical pivot. Every 20 minutes of seated work must be broken by just 60 seconds of active standing, calf raises, or torso rotations. This brief mechanical interruption is enough to restart the hydrodynamic imbibition pump within your intervertebral discs, flush your capillaries with fresh lipoprotein lipase, and signal your brain that your body is a dynamic, highly evolved engine of movement, rather than a decomposing monument to convenience. By establishing these micro-movements, you fundamentally alter the cellular signaling pathways within your connective tissue matrix, triggering a deep structural metamorphosis. The fibroblasts, the specialized cells responsible for weaving your fascial web, respond directly to these shifting mechanical tensions. When you break the cycle of static seating, these cells cease production of the dense, disorganized collagen crosslinks that bind your muscles together. Instead, they begin secreting fresh hyaluronic acid, a highly hydrophilic molecule that can hold up to 1,000 times its weight in water. This sudden surge of hydration floods the deep layers of the thoracolumbar fascia, transforming the stiff, glue-like restrictions back into a slick, sliding, elastic sheet. Your lower back loses its chronic brittleness, reclaiming its natural capacity to absorb, store, and return kinetic energy with every step you take. As this soft tissue restriction dissolves, your cardiovascular system undergoes an immediate hemodynamic optimization, activating your lower limbs, even through subtle weight shifts and brief standing intervals, instantly engages the deep venous pump of the soleus and gastrocnemius muscles. With every minor contraction, these muscles squeeze the deep veins of your lower legs, forcing pooled, deoxygenated blood upward past the one-way venous valves and back into central circulation. Simultaneously, the endothelium, the microscopic inner lining of your blood vessels, registers this increased shear stress from the moving blood and releases a surge of nitric oxide. This potent signaling molecule diffuses directly into the smooth muscle walls of your arteries, causing them to relax and dilate. Your systemic blood pressure drops, the workload on your heart decreases, and your entire circulatory tree is cleared of metabolic stagnation, allowing oxygen and glucose to reach your peripheral tissues with effortless efficiency. This circulatory restoration instantly activates the metabolic sink of your skeletal muscle tissue, permanently repairing your insulin sensitivity. As your quadriceps, glutes, and core stabilizers engage to support your posture against gravity, the mechanical stretching of the cell membranes triggers the immediate translocation of GLUT- for storage vesicles. These specialized transport proteins migrate to the surface of the muscle cells and dock directly with the plasma membranes, opening thousands of microscopic channels for glucose to flood inside. Crucially, because this process is driven entirely by mechanical muscle contraction, it bypasses the insulin pathway completely. Your blood sugar drops rapidly and naturally, relieving the beta cells of your pancreas from the exhausting demand of constant insulin overproduction. Your body shifts out of its defensive, fat-storing, insulin-resistant state and re-enters an active, fat-burning, glycogen-replenishing state that stabilizes your energy levels for the rest of the day. This newfound systemic efficiency extends into your thoracic cavity, completely liberating your respiratory and digestive architecture. When you step out of the slumped, posterior pelvic tilt, your rib cage expands, instantly relieving the physical compaction of your abdominal organs. Your stomach and intestines drop back into their optimal anatomical positions, allowing the smooth, rhythmic waves of peristalsis to move food and waste through your digestive tract without restriction or acid reflux. More importantly, this structural opening unlocks the diaphragm. No longer pinned down by a collapsed torso, this massive, dome-shaped muscle can finally descend fully during inhalation, drawing air deep into the highly vascularized lower lobes of your lungs. This maximizes your oxygen to carbon dioxide exchange, eliminating the low-grade hypercapnia that keeps your brain on high alert. Your amygdala stands down, your sympathetic nervous system quietens, and the slow, corrosive drip of cortisol is replaced by a balanced, clear-headed state of neurological calm. This respiratory liberation completes its upward cascade by restoring the natural, rhythmic purification of your central nervous system. As your posture straightens and your suboccipital muscles relax, the constriction at the base of your skull is completely removed. Simultaneously, the free, uninhibited movement of your sacrum restores the mechanical efficiency of the craniosacral pump. With every deep, diaphragmatic breath you take, the changing pressure gradients within your spinal column drive a powerful, rhythmic wave of cerebrospinal fluid upward through the spinal canal and into the cerebral ventricles. This accelerated fluid circulation acts as a high-pressure flush for your brain, rapidly sweeping away the metabolic waste products, amyloid beta plaques, and tau proteins that accumulated during hours of static focus. The afternoon brain fog vanishes, replaced by a sharp, sustained cognitive clarity and an ambient sense of vitality that is your birthright. Ultimately, your spine is the structural mirror of your daily habits. It was never meant to be a static column molded to the geometry of a modern chair. It was engineered to be a living, adapting, high-tensile masterpiece of evolutionary architecture. By consciously reclaiming your pelvic alignment, releasing your short and hip flexors, and introducing continuous, variable movement into your daily life, you are doing far more than simply fixing bad posture. You are actively stepping back into the ancestral user manual of the human body. You are choosing to feed your spinal discs, to hydrate your fascia, to unweight your central nervous system, and to allow your brain to communicate with your limbs without structural interference. Stop sitting like a modern artifact and start moving like a human.